Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of When One Thing Ends, Another Can Begin. This will be Part 13, Chapter 7, entitled Echoes of Past Conversations. Death Arms didn't really want to be here. The crowds were packed, even with the events about to start, and he was stuck trying to keep an eye out for any problems. Being assigned security detail was a giant pain in the ass when it'd be so much more beneficial to be in the stands and actually watch the festival. That way he could get some decent scouting done instead of having to rely on the sidekicks at his agency. Kamui Woods seemed to share a similar mindset, especially with the spotlight that was on the 1A class this year. First years often didn't get too many scouting offers, so it'd be their best chance to create a connection with the students before they started making names for themselves. Mount Lady seemed to be more concerned about missing out on the show and getting the most out of the stalls that were set up outside of the arena. She was acting like a festival goer more than a hero on patrol. Death Arms had no idea why she'd been asked to do this, or group with them, when she was so new and clearly unprofessional. They were taking a quick break to grab something to eat, though Mount Lady had been doing that the whole time, when the monitors outside the stadiums burst to life at the beginnings of the event. It was the unusual promotional garbage and announcements at first, enough to make Death Arms zone out and focus instead on his food, before they finally announced the classes. Of course, you couldn't tell much by just watching them walk into the stadium. There was a reason they had actual events, but you could get a feel for... Wait a second. The camera cut to a wider view, but Death Arms could still make out the mop of green hair that he'd all but forgotten about. "Is that the damn quirkless kid?" Kamui leaned back in his chair, away from where Death Arms was now half standing to try and get a better view. "What are you talking about?" Death Arms just gestured at the screen as he tried to pick out the kid again, to make sure his eyes and memory weren't playing a trick on him. "The green-haired one. The idiot that ran into that sludge villain incident a year ago. See, look, he's..." The camera was going over each of the classes, and Death Arms' words died in his mouth as he saw the 1A appear on the screen, right under the group of students that included the quirkless kid. Kamui looked between him and the screen a few times, but ended up shaking his head. "I know the event you're talking about, but I don't remember anyone like that. It has been a year, after all." "If it was any other kid, then I would have forgotten as well, but he was a rude, tiny, useless, quirkless kid who asked me if I thought he could be a hero right after nearly getting killed by a villain, just making the situation worse." Wait, wasn't that a joke? Mount Lady had chosen that point to pay attention, apparently, looking up at the screen herself. Or maybe it was. I mean, he's in UA, so he must have a quirk, right? He'd thought that day would be the last time he ever saw that kid. Memorable aside from his pathetic nature and stupid question, but here he was, wasting a place in UA's heroics course, if the information on screen could be trusted. How that could have happened was beyond him, but there wasn't much he could do now but keep watching. The clamor of the stadium was only getting louder with the announcement of the first event, though Cementos knew it was nowhere near the peak it would reach throughout the day. From his position on the sidelines, he could see the students heading towards the entry of the obstacle course. Aside from some slight trouble with the pits and pillars section, his work in creating the course had gone smoothly, and hadn't involved too much quirk use compared to previous years. Of course, he still had to build a whole platform for the third event, but that would be fairly simple. Connection pipes that allowed for the passage of cement directly into the arenas had been a fantastic idea on Nezu's behalf. What he hadn't been so sure of was his decision to allow Midoriya to compete in the sports festival. It had been a short argument that had taken place in the staff room, but Vlad King had brought forward some valid concerns about the student's ability to compete, both on account for his quirklessness and the recent villain attack he'd gone through. Eraserhead had been quick to shut it down, with many of the other teachers joining him in his discrimination argument. Midoriya was smart, fast, and had Eraserhead firmly in his corner, so he must have some heroic potential. Cementos just wasn't sure how that would measure up to everyone else, not to mention the potential backlash since UA still hadn't released an official statement on the quirkless student rumors. Well, he'd already beaten the odds by getting in with the entrance exam and then passing Eraserhead's high standards, so Cementos wouldn't put anything past him. As the siren went off and the event began in earnest, he hoped that luck was on Midoriya's side today. Given how much destruction the first years were managing to cause in the obstacle course alone, 13 knew they would have their hands full with the cleanup that always came afterwards. They were very glad they weren't a janitor responsible for all the stands and rooms, but getting rid of all the rubble and metal shards and who knows what was always a tedious job. It always felt different when it was clearing up an arena and not rescue work. After the attack on the USJ, they had spent a fair amount of time cleaning up the collapse zone. It was meant to be in ruins, but there was a method to it all, and the Nomu creature and All Might had done quite a number on the area. That had felt tedious. But when they'd first started, when there had still been villains in the area and students missing, it had been just as intense as dealing with a disaster site. Technically, it was. Eraserhead had admitted to them afterwards that he'd been worried that they would be the one to find his student in the collapse zone. 13 had been worried they were going to find him there after destroying yet another pile of debris, surrounded again by rubble for their second meeting, but this time there would be no questions, only the silence that accompanied those recovered far too late. 13 wanted to, they didn't know, apologize maybe. Once they'd learned the true nature of the landslide's tip-off, they'd been angry, because they thought that Midoriya could have tried harder to alert different authorities when there were lives at stake. But he had tried, even knowing he would fail, so he'd also shown up to help, even if he did have some ulterior motives. Hearing him tell the hand villain that he hadn't even believed he would get a yes had made 13 feel all the worse for their answer. They'd been thinking about the benefits of saving people as a hero versus as a doctor or some other profession, given that the heroics industry wasn't suited for a quirkless person, so the thought that they might be crushing a dream had never crossed their mind. Just how many heroes had Midoriya asked before them? What number were they on that list of 237? Soon they would have to find time or a reason to explain themselves to Midoriya, and let him know they thought he would be an amazing hero. Ryuku, along with much of Japan's population, who were following the broadcast of the sports festival, watched as the boy exploded from the tunnel, still running full speed. As the camera focused on his face and the announcer shouted the results, she recognized him. She'd been curious about the class that had survived a villain attack, which was why she was watching the first year's live, rather than the third, but she hadn't expected that to be a face she'd ever see again. It had been a bad day, and his appearance in question had brought an element of confusion to the day. She'd wondered who he was, but had never tried to follow up on him, and had gradually forgotten about the quirkless child who had dropped in front of her almost a year ago. He clearly hadn't taken her no for an answer. Ryuku focused on him, even as the camera switched angle, so all the arriving competitors could be seen. She'd said no for a very good reason, but he'd managed to make it into UA, which was a testament to whatever skills he might have. Not all heroes had incredibly powerful quirks either. She kept watching. His jaw dropped. He'd managed to get the day off since watching the festival was something he could do from home, but now he'd wished he'd stayed at the agency. Spinning Top was meant to be looking for scouting opportunities. Even though he wasn't a big hero, his agency liked to be inclusive and use everyone's input, so he watched the event so he could let them know if any of the kids looked halfway decent. But holy shit, had he not expected the return of the green quirkless kid. He fumbled for his phone as the points were announced and the sharks began circling. He needed to text Urusu now and make sure they were watching. This was going to be a bloodbath. However this kid got in must have been a joke, and he sure as hell was going to make the most of the entertainment from it. With a shout, his TV was turned off, the remote going through the screen in a shower of glass and electronics just as effective as using the button. The fucking joke of a kid had been acting as if he had any business being at UA, participating in events with Japan's upcoming heroes. Marauder's chest was still heaving, his quirk boiling under his skin, thinking about the disgusting little fuck and his ridiculous question. He should have put him out of everyone's misery when he had a chance a year ago. Condenser was having a great time, his agency finally paying up to allow him and Ukiyo to watch the UA Sports Festival in person. Hell, they even had business kids running around selling food and whatnot, which had saved him a walk to the stands outside. He probably wasn't the best person to be here with the fact that he couldn't give a shit about looking for scoutable students. Condenser was here because it was a childhood dream of his, and he was finally big enough that he could use his influence as an excuse, but he didn't regret going one bit. The leading team was throwing their rider around and their horse, The kid who had won the first round and seemed to be in control of it all was wild. What a fantastic day. He couldn't wait to see how they upped this in the third round. Eraserhead watched Midoriya celebrate with his team as they came out of the second round with the 10 million points still in hand. He couldn't see clearly from his position in the commentator's booth, but the camera was wasting no time as it trailed the winning team, even as they began to leave the field. He'd known Midoriya was smart enough to be prepared for whatever was going to happen and was creative, or desperate, enough to deal with whatever he hadn't practiced. But Eraserhead hadn't expected him to take indisputable firsts in both events. First years rarely dominated each event, as they had yet to broaden their skill set and different events catered to different quirks and fighting styles. But here was UA's first quirkless student, decimating the competition. He was so proud. He would be happier if Midoriya actually went to Hound Dog for some counseling like he'd suggested after the USJ incident, or saw anyone about the problems he'd accumulated in his past of pain and neglect, but outwardly, no one would be able to say Midoriya didn't have potential. He would never admit it, especially not while in the commentator's booth, but he hoped, and had pretty good evidence to suggest it was possible, that Midoriya would win the whole festival. For now, he curled up into his sleeping bag to nap while they had a lunch break and held the recreational events. Best Jeanist looked at the matchups for the second segment of the third round. Some of them would be very interesting indeed, if their performances in the first segment was any indication. There was destruction and mobility versus creation in the Ashido and Yagirozu match, and mobility against versatility in the Ida and Shiozaki match. But to start with, it would be Midoriya versus Todoroki. Of course, Todoroki would be the winner in this case, given his previous match, and the fact that Midoriya seemed to be the physical brawler type, but it would be interesting to see if he came up with any way to avoid Todoroki's ice, as the boy had given away a powerful play in the first match. Something about Midoriya also seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He could hear the riot that was happening in the first-year arena all the way from the third-year arena where he was posted. Of course, it wasn't an actual riot, but all the heroes inside the stadium had been contacted and told to be ready in case things got out of hand. For Ectoplasm, that wasn't a problem, as he'd been able to instantly send some of his clones in the direction of the first-year arena to act as backup. All of this over a quirk, or rather, a lack of one. The fact that Midoriya didn't have a quirk couldn't realistically matter when he was stronger than the entire first year to have gotten this far. Ectoplasm worked in absolutes, always had, and it was stupid to think that a child who had gotten into UA, passed Eraserhead's quirk assessment, and fought villains not to mention done well in the sports festival, did not belong in here. Even if it wasn't clear he'd make it as a hero yet, he deserved his place at UA. Recovery Girl muttered to herself about self-sacrificing idiot hero types as she walked through the halls looking for Midoriya. He should have waited to be cleared before he left the infirmary. That boy was far too comfortable with pain and worried too much about being a bother when looking after him was part of her job. Of course, she'd prefer if he didn't need her help, but that went for anyone that came to her with an injury. She'd have to make sure she trained that out of him before he graduated and became a hero, otherwise he'd become worse than Aizawa was back in his early days. Finishing her survey of the floor and finding no sign of him, she sighed and headed back to the infirmary. He'd probably gone up to join his friends, so there was no use following him up there. Recovery Girl had healed the worst of his injury anyway. It'd be better for him to be with his friends now, who could support him over that disqualification, than to sit in the infirmary some more. Those two ladies were right. Kasagiriman had thought about it more and found most arguments surrounding quirklessness and heroics were "it's too dangerous." But he'd known heroes who had powerful quirks and ended up dead, and those who had weak quirks and had ended up excelling. Watching the kid get disqualified for doing what he could to win, and Kasagiriman didn't exactly agree with the method, but if you're arguing he couldn't be a hero because he couldn't fight or was weak or stupid, then he certainly proved them wrong, was saddening. He hoped that Midoriya would keep moving forward again, just like the first time they'd met, scarred legs walking back up a mountain to help more people who might hate him for it, refusing to give up. The sports festival was intense this year. They kept getting told to watch the third years to scout for new sidekicks, but they weren't good at picking people to go with their brand. Buck and Inko left that to managers, and then picked from short lists, and usually based their decision on personality, It was hard to save lives when you're busy hating your coworkers, so they picked whoever they thought would work best, especially considering they weren't someone who was great with people. So, instead of watching the third years live, they watched the first years. Bakaneko knew others wouldn't agree with them, but they found it much more fun, with the participants more prone to trying wild ideas considering they were just starting out and learning their limits. To their surprise, their late-night follower had been there, the quirkless kid. Watching him run around and strategize better than some of the pro heroes they knew, Bakaneko was now certain about the new conclusion they'd come to. They didn't think much about heroics as an industry. They wanted to help people. Ever since they'd watched a pro hero save their father from a villain attack that had swept through their childhood town, they'd wanted to do something similar. Luckily for them, after they'd graduated, they'd gotten a placement in Tokyo, where they had met their manager, and from there, they'd gotten marketed and promoted and as a result had shot up the ranks. The perks were great. Their family was now well looked after, and Bakaneko could probably retire soon if they really had to. But heroics had never been about the money. It had always been about sneaking through the shadows to take down threats. Which is why they hadn't thought twice about telling the kid that he couldn't make it without a quirk. It was a dangerous job, and quirks are what made people powerful or popular. But after that night, they'd done some thinking, a little research, and decided they might be wrong. Not everyone could become a hero, that was ridiculous. But saying that just because you didn't have a quirk meant you couldn't be one wasn't right. There were plenty of things you could do without a quirk, plenty of things heroes without combative quirks already did, that would be available to someone without a quirk. Too bad the majority of the stadium goers and officials didn't seem to get that yet. It was kinda sad to see the explosion boy and the ice one fight against each other when it could have been the little green-haired kid who had asked Bakaneko if he could be a hero, and hadn't taken their wrong answer to heart. Bakaneko hummed to themselves, tails swaying and hitting the edge of their couch. Next year they might watch the second-year festival instead of prioritizing the first. They didn't think the quirkless boy's story would end here. All Might walked through the emptying halls of the sports festival stadium, trying to stay away from the crowds. He probably wouldn't be recognized in this emaciated form, but he was in his All Might costume, and that would raise some questions that he couldn't afford to answer. That just brought him back to a question he couldn't answer for another set of reasons. I lost my second match of this round to Midoriya Izuku, and should not be the one up on this podium. Todoroki had been so sure in his decision, in his words, and All Might wished he could go back in time and have that same belief and conviction. He regretted what he'd said, and wanted nothing more than to fix the issue and apologize, but Midoriya had made it clear that he did not want to speak to him. All Might had to respect that choice. But as he walked down empty halls, he thought about the boy who wanted to be a hero, more than anything, but unlike him, was not gifted a quirk. Midoriya would spend his whole life dealing with the problems that arose from that, and All Might wanted nothing more than to help him. If only he could somehow reach out to him without hurting him. Lights Up awakened sometime in the mid-afternoon, blinking blearily. He'd had a string of night shifts, which honestly made his job easier, but they took it out of him. By the time the sun was setting, he was more or less functional, dressed, and ready to watch the festival he'd recorded. It wasn't like he was influential enough to get a sidekick out of it, but you could not watch the UA Sports Festival. He'd made it through the third years and was eating his dinner when he'd switched to the first years. Honestly, anyone who preferred to watch the second years was ridiculous. Third years knew what they were doing and made a show of it, while the first were out of their minds if they weren't boring. He was only half watching, taking a quick drink before he finished off the last of his food, when the winner of the first round was announced, and he choked, coughing and spluttering as the green-haired quirkless kid looked back at him from the screen. There was absolutely no way it could be the same kid. Lights Up was certain, but it sure looked like the waste of space that had fallen near him months ago. Finally getting his breath back, he started paying just a bit more attention to the festival. No one ever considered the fact that pro heroes had to get from point to point within cities, and that many didn't have the space for a car. Of course, they couldn't go in full costume. That would get way too much attention and just slow them down. One of the reasons Edshot had let his design team make his costume so elaborate was because it made identifying him in his regular civilian attire that much more difficult. The other people on the train didn't even look at him twice, so he relaxed a bit into his seat, putting an earphone in so he could watch the highlight reel of the sports festival. His agency didn't have a teaching license, so he never bothered trying to watch the event live. He preferred to just watch the interesting stuff after the event had aired. Surprisingly, a lot of the clips from this year mentioned quirklessness. Ed Schott felt like he was asked about that a while ago, but it was a hazy memory, so probably not too important. His curiosity won out, and he clicked on one of the shorter ones. Some were almost an hour long, and he had no idea what they could be about. What he got was a quirkless student, disqualified from the tournament due to his use of tools in a match. Definitely a creative solution, but Ed Schott could see how it could be deemed cheating. He clicked on the next highlighted clip of the match between the boy who had lost and the winner, and the train kept moving toward its destination. Coda was finally in bed, and the rest of them were getting settled on the couch. Were they professional heroes? Yes. Did they also like to watch the UA Sports Festival cuddled up with blankets on the couch and copious amounts of popcorn? Also yes. Ragdoll curled deeper into the nest of blankets and pillows she'd made for herself in the lone armchair while she waited for Tiger to bring over the popcorn. It was fun to watch the festival, as a group of friends, like their early days, but it was also useful since they often collaborated with UA to help train the kittens for rescue and wilderness scenarios. That's why they usually only got around to watching the first and second year festivals, since it was good to know who they'd be working with in the future. They used to do this during the day, watching one year in real time while the others were recorded, but Coda refused to watch the event, claiming it was stupid and quirk-focused. "Someone press play because the popcorn has arrived, and if we don't start watching soon, I'm going to fall asleep again." Tiger jumped over the back of the couch, startling Mandalay, but somehow not spilling the bowl. Pixie Bob just snickered and started the recording while Ragdoll made grabby hands until Tiger passed the bowl to her. "That's for all of us, you know. If you eat it all, you have to make more, and we're not pausing for you." Ragdoll knew that was Pixie Bob's way of saying, "Could I have some popcorn?" but Ragdoll decided to instead fill her mouth with another handful, only slightly chewing before replying. "That's fair." The bowl was taken from her hands by Mandalay, ever the peacemaker, and handed over before another popcorn war could break out. The peace lasted for the next few minutes, the only sounds coming from the television and the occasional comment when Pixie Bob suddenly straightened up and really focused. Before she could ask what she'd spotted, Ragdoll noticed it too, the winner of the first round. "Do you recognize him too? He was at the landslide, right?" Mandalay and Tiger both looked confused, but Ragdoll was too busy waving her arms around from her nest to help them with that. "Yeah, he asked if he could be a hero without a quirk." "What are you two talking about?" Pixie Bob just shushed Tiger while Ragdoll leaned over towards the other two, trying to explain quietly without speaking over the results and the announcement of the next event. She quickly went over the landslide, how they'd found a group next to a half-collapsed shrine, how one of those people was a young boy who asked them a question, and was currently looking terrified as the points for the headbands were announced. Tiger's eyebrows were raised by the time she finished speaking. "Honestly, good on him. That's some pretty strong determination." "Yeah, I didn't really expect to see him again." Ragdoll's attention was back on the television just as the starting alarm went off and the second event started. "Well, it helps if you two encouraged him." Ragdoll kept her eyes on the television, purposefully not looking at Pixie Bob despite the fact that she could feel her eyes on her. She'd never been good at hiding her expressions, so if she turned to acknowledge Pixie Bob, then Mandalay would definitely know something was up. That didn't seem to be enough, though, and soon the both of them were getting a stern talking to about encouragement and being positive role models, Mandalay's mum tone in full swing. "We'll just have to fix this when we next meet the kid," Pixie Bob cut in. "When he comes to train with us, we can tell him how wrong we were, and that he's pretty cool for making it without a quirk." Seemingly not sensing anything wrong with the idea, Mandalay let them all go back to watching the festival and cheering on their new favorite participant. It was getting quite late by the time Gang Orga finished reviewing possible candidates from the sports festival. Usually it didn't take so long, as he would choose from those that made it to the third round and save himself time by skipping the first and second events. But today, he'd had to go back and watch the first and second rounds for the first-year tournament. He still didn't know what to think. Midoriya, the quirkless child he'd met a year ago, had been disqualified. However, he'd also won his match, and the first two events. He was quirkless, and therefore couldn't be a hero. However, he was already in the UA Heroics course. Midoriya conflicted with everything he knew. Quirkless people hadn't been a majority for generations, though most people had grown up knowing at least one person without a quirk in his generation. There was nothing wrong with being quirkless, but they were limited in a world with quirks. But Midoriya by virtue of making it into UA's heroics course and winning 2 events only to be kicked out on a disqualification rather than a loss in the third, went against what he'd learned. Just as he had defied normality when they first met and had gotten a whole tour group to embrace being led by Gang Orca, a villainous-looking hero, Midoriya defied normality and the quirkless standard here. Gang Orca had heard many times that he would grow up to be a villain when he was young. Even after becoming a hero and rising through the ranks, many people still called him villainous-looking, and the public reacted accordingly when he walked the streets, but at least they recognized him and acknowledged his power and abilities. What would it be like to be thought of as nothing and treated accordingly? He shifted around in his seat again, trying to stretch his muscles without actually getting up. It had been another long day, but he was expected to pick a UA student to take on for a work experience week. Watching the sports festival recording wasn't the worst thing he'd ever had to do, and it gave him a minute to sit down, even if his wings itched to be out flying for just a bit longer. The Heroics Commission had suggested he choose from the first-year students, specifically the class that had already faced a villain attack and therefore had some experience. Of course, Hawks knew that suggestions from the Heroics Commission were just nicely phrased instructions, so he paid special attention to Class 1A as they walked into the stadium. It was because of that he was able to spot a head of green hair amongst the class, and he really, really hoped that was who he thought it was. It took until the end of the first round to find out, but bursting from the tunnel in a dead sprint and taking first place was none other than the green-haired quirkless kid who had thrown himself off a building. If any of the others working in the agency heard a, "Oh, hell yeah!" coming from his office, then that was their own business. He was invested now, eyes glued to the screen as he finally learned the kid's name, Midoriya Izuku. The folder he'd given Hawks was filed away somewhere in the building, since they'd managed to use all the information from it by now, but Hawks could still remember the notes set across every available space, only giving away to the occasional chart or map or diagram. Thanks to his standing, he'd been able to pass it off as something an informant had given to him, rather than setting the bloodhounds on a kid who was too smart with too little. He'd done a bit of investigation himself, but without a lot of free time he hadn't been able to find any more on the kid. The Heroics Commission, not to mention the rest of society, would definitely give Midoriya hell for trying to be a hero, but judging by the fact that he was at UA, skilled enough to win an event against other kids with powerful quirks, and had whatever smarts that had compiled that folder, he was going to give them hell right back. Hawks wished he could change his answer. He had months ago, but the kid didn't know that. Maybe there was some way to fix that. Inko kept her eyes trained on the television, the flickering motion on screen and the sound, the only thing keeping her up at such a late hour. The both of them were staying up much later than usual. Well, she was at least. Izuku did have a bedtime, but she wasn't naive enough to believe he conformed to it, especially when she'd never enforced it, to watch the rest of the sports festival. She was so proud of her little boy for getting there and for winning the first 2 events. Of course, she had been crying and a nervous wreck the whole time, but that didn't change the fact that she was amazed at her son. The disqualification, however, wasn't something she knew what to make of. Ever since the villain attack that had happened on campus and led to her Izuku receiving a permanent scar, she had wanted to pull him out of UA. If it weren't for the joy she saw in him these days, his determination proud and relentless, she probably would have. But she thought he might be happy at UA, and she didn't want to be the person who ruined that for him. She'd followed the argument they'd made for his disqualification, but she hadn't spoken to Izuku about it yet. He had looked so tired when he got home, not to mention there were signs that he'd been crying, so she hadn't wanted to pry. Not when it seemed so unfair to him, even if the argument had made sense. So when he'd asked if they could watch the 2nd and 3rd years tournaments tonight, because of course she'd recorded them for him, she had agreed straight away. Now it was almost exactly midnight and they'd been snacking and watching for hours. Izuku had been quieter than usual. He made an effort not to spoil the outcome for her, given that he was always an event ahead, but he couldn't help muttering, and it made her worry just that bit more. They were in the break between the 2nd and last events for the 3rd years when he suddenly spoke up, still curled up on his side of the couch. "Do you think someone quirkless can be a hero?" Inko blinked dumbly at her son for a moment, trying to process his question. "Izuku, what are you talking about?" But he just stayed in the same position, watching the television, and repeated the question. It took a moment, but a memory, faded from age, finally made its way to the forefront of her mind. A similar question, asked by a 4-year-old who had recently been diagnosed as quirkless, watching the same video of All Might over and over again. Looking at him as he was now, quiet, distant, so different from that time, she realized that of course he had begun to keep things from her. Of course, he had seemed so empty in the lead-up to UA, only to come alive when he'd made it in. He didn't believe his own mother would support him. And was he wrong? She hadn't believed he could live up to his heroic dreams until he'd already proven himself by getting into UA. And it was only then that she'd started giving the support that he deserved the whole time. "I'm so sorry, Izuku." She watched him tense up at those words, going just a bit stiffer, and sending a stab through her heart because it was her words, now and all those years ago, that made him react that way. So she continued her sentence, saying the words that should have been said years ago. "Of course, you can be a hero." All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 7 of When One Thing Ends, Another Can Begin. Chapter 8 is the last and final chapter, which will be started next. Not sure if I'm going to have to break it up yet or not, so we'll find out in the next video. But I hope you all are still enjoying this one. Let me know your thoughts and reactions to this. Personally, I'm a huge fan of the fact that it came like full circle with the reactions from the heroes that is a good question before. I really like Hawks and even 13's reactions. Those were probably two that kind of stood out a lot to me. Then I think that ending it with Inko's being one of the first times that Izuku asked that question after being diagnosed quirkless to his own mom, I think that really just it shocked me when I first read this. It was so good. It was unexpected when you're going through a list of people that were asked. It didn't even occur to me to have Inko in there as well, but it makes so much sense. So I'm eager to hear your overall thoughts and reactions to this one. And as always, thank you so much for listening.